Ladies and gentlemen, it is Friday, noon somewhere, and we are back for another AskTHAT. Today with me I have Robert Boedigheimer, good friend, that conference extraordinaire, community person, lover of HTTP. Robert, how are you, sir?
Doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being here today. So, ironically, we're going to talk about HTTP and a bunch of stuff that goes along with it. And we had a show last night where we talked with Ol from DNS Simple about HTTP 2, so it's kind of a good segue. But before we get into that and start riffing, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Okay. So Robert Boedigheimer, and I work for an e-commerce site. It's my full-time job, so that's what I do every day. But then on the side, I've been doing conference speaking since about 2004.
Okay.
And then I was in London doing a web perf talk, and somebody stopped up and said, we don't have this in Pluralsight. Do you want to be a Pluralsight author? So I added that on. So I've got 8 courses on Pluralsight on various web-related topics. And
Wow.
So keep busy as everyone else does with things like that. Like I said, being a full-time developer all the time and then adding the 2 side things. So
that's right. Everything web all day long.
Pretty much, and night.
Yes. And so let's, you had mentioned you're switching things to HTTPS. And when you had said that, or at least before we started talking, when you had said that, you had made it feel like that this is a kind of monumental effort. It's more difficult than maybe somebody anticipated. Like, how is it not just buying a certificate?
Right. Yeah. So I guess for the history, so we've used HTTPS for a long time. I've been a web developer for, let's just say 20 plus years.
Yeah. I was going to say
so,
10.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I've been doing it for a long time, and back then HTTPS and SSL was very hardware intensive. So it was really a big performance hit, and it was a big deal to do HTTPS. So that's kind of the history I walked into.
Okay.
We've obviously used it for portions of our sites for a long time. Contact us stuff, log in, the core stuff where we knew we were transmitting. And we knew we wanted to get there someday because there were still a lot of things that get exposed when you're not using HTTPS over the rest of your site.
Sure.
And so I think the final kick was last fall. Chrome started to say if you had an HTTP page with a form control on it, and they put their cursor in there and you're using HTTP, it just says not secure big up by the URL.
Yep.
And that was something that just wasn't going to be acceptable anymore for our customers on a site that they want to trust.
Sure.
So we started going down the path of switching the entire site to use HTTPS. And so that's been interesting. And even though I had used it prior, I hadn't used a lot of the latest techniques that you can use.
Okay.
So one of them was strict transport security.
Okay.
So I can actually send back a response header that says, every time you come back now, I want you to remember that I had redirected you from HTTP to HTTPS, and I don't want you to use HTTP anymore.
Gotcha.
So that was a big advantage. And the nice thing is you don't even have to fix if I have links that are wrong, if I got HTTP in an email, or if I just had a favorite or a bookmark, or I typed it in. Once I've come to the site once and got that strict transport security, now it's going to keep that in my browser for however long I specify, and there's no way I can come back to your site again using HTTP, which is pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. So you get into this, obviously Chrome and others, there's a big push to just have HTTPS everywhere, which is fantastic.
Yep.
No reason really not to do it. Like, there's no harm in it. What were some of the other gotchas in this?
So some of the gotchas, working with a lot of third-party people. So if you use a lot of other third parties on your website, not all of them had converted or were aware and up on HTTPS yet. So we had to work through that with some various partners and such. But if people include things wrong, they can have an HTTP link, and then you get that nice gold bar in IE or in Chrome saying this is not all secured.
Sure.
And so there's you can set a content security policy. So you can actually specify what I want to have happen when that occurs so that I never have those kind of warnings pop up again. And that's supported by Chrome and all the latest browsers. So you can just set, we chose to do block all mixed content. So basically I say, if you code it wrong and you're not testing, too bad. It's not going to make that request.
Sure.
And the dev tools for Chrome has made a big improvement where years ago, we were talking about Fiddler earlier too. Yeah. Years ago, trying to track down, if you've ever done this, you've got a page with lots of stuff on it and you get that warning and you're trying to figure out who exactly is making that request, right? Yeah. Who's doing it wrong
right.
out of all the things that I'm including. And so what Chrome does now that's kind of cool in the dev tools is they have a security tab and they just specifically say, you're on an HTTPS page, but here are the 4 resources that you're pulling in with HTTP. Sure. So something that used to be more difficult is really simple now. So that helped us a lot to be able to convert and make sure everybody was doing what they're supposed to and then blocking anybody who wasn't. So.
Yeah, totally. Let's talk about the development side of things. I mean, what does development look like? I mean, do people all have their own certificates? Do you have your own certificate store? Do you do HTTP and then, you get to the test farms and then you just use HTTPS there?
Yeah, so for us, I like to run IIS on my own machine. So we're a Windows shop. Okay. And so I want to run IIS locally. So I just have a self-signed cert on my own machine because I want it encrypted from the very beginning. And I don't like working in an environment that isn't what my stage in production is going to be.
Sure.
So we got self-signed certs on our own machine that are just straightforward to set up and attach to an IIS site so that I've got everything in development is being encrypted.
Okay.
And so I'm coding it from the very beginning without having to deal with not having it.
Sure.
Or what will happen when I get into a staging environment.
I mean, was that decision purely a financial one and rather than just getting a development certificate? I mean, getting another certificate that's for all the developers to use?
I think the management, and really since nobody else is accessing my machine, it's not really a hindrance. It's simple to set up, but it's also easy. I mean, you can go get certificates pretty easily now.
Yep.
It was just the management issue of why do that when there's no real benefit on my development machine. The HTTPS, when people talk about certificates and Let's Encrypt and all of the other stuff that's out there now, the actual HTTPS portion of that's going to be the same. So, I mean, It doesn't matter if I have self-signed or not. The certificate's not really what's driving how the encryption and everything else is occurring with all the Cypher suites and stuff. So that was the easiest way to set it up.
Sure. How does it change things like debugging? I mean, you mentioned Fiddler earlier and some of the Chrome dev tools. I mean, what does your debugging situation look like in that path?
So years ago, like I said, when we did HTTPS, everything went dark, right? I mean, suddenly so I've used Fiddler forever. And I used all the tools, loved it, and then suddenly you put up an HTTPS, and a long time ago that would be a barrier because I couldn't see it.
Sure.
Cool thing with Fiddler, they have the feature where you can basically have Fiddler be a man in the middle because it's a proxy. Mm-hmm. My browser's talking to Fiddler, so as I go to a site that wants to use HTTPS, Fiddler is auto-generating its own certificate and sending that down to the client.
Sure.
Then it can do the decryption in the middle and then re-encrypt back on the wire. So it's still safe on the wire, but that's what allows Fiddler to sit in the middle, intercept that request. So the nice thing is I go and enable that. I tell it to trust the Fiddler root in my browser, and then I get Fiddler will work like you would expect.
Sure.
And now that Chrome DevTools has progressed, all the dev tools in the browsers have gotten so much better. They have network tabs, and by that point in the browser, it's already decrypted, so I don't need to worry about that. And then if you've used Wireshark at all for doing any of the true network monitoring, you can actually set it up to say, I want my browser to save off the SSL, or I hate saying that word, HTTPS. The HTTPS, I can actually save off the keys onto my own machine, and then I can hook up Wireshark to look for those keys used for the encryption. So even though it's not a proxy, I can decrypt it in Wireshark as well. So the good news is now that everybody's doing this, the tools have really advanced and made it a lot easier for people to be able to troubleshoot. So that was one of the barriers before, because you get to the most important pages on your site, suddenly you're dark is not a good way to have to develop.
Yeah, for sure.
So
it's well, let me back. So let's talk about certificates a little bit. Are all certificates equal?
So they're not. If you talk about extended. So they basically have the domain, the normal certificates that most people have. And there's a lot of debate in the security community. I follow a lot of people on Twitter, and they're wondering about the extended validation. So if you go to some of the sites and you see the extra green and it's got the actual, depending on what your browser is, it specifies who actually owns it. It's a higher level of validation to get that certificate. The problem is none of my customers know that, right? I mean, they don't care. They don't care between those two. So the only other thing that's really changed stuff is Let's Encrypt. So I mean that one of the hindrances before was you had to pay money, right?
Yep.
And it's funny, I was speaking to a user group and years ago my joke was, grandma's quilting site doesn't need to use HTTPS. And a guy
turns out grandma's selling those quilts for a lot of money and she does need them.
A guy in the audience came up and slid his business card over and he runs a quilting hub. And he had just been on HTTPS, so anyways, kind of funny. But now with Let's Encrypt, those kinds of people that would have had a barrier before to getting into HTTPS can use those sorts of certificates and get those set up. And like I said, the actual encryption is the same. Yep. You just have to rev those certificates more often is basically the only drawback.
Sure. I'm going to ask the famous age-old question because I think it's happened to everybody, Microsoft, my own companies, everybody. How do you track your production certificate and when it's going to expire?
I don't have to. That's the good news. Yeah, I mean, our operations group takes care of that for the servers that we're on, so that's not luckily my responsibility. But
I say it because I think we've all had that, like, oh, it doesn't work anymore. What's wrong?
Yeah, what's wrong? Certificates. Yeah. That's a bad thing. So I know we put it on calendars, check periodically, see how close are we on our certificates. DevTools is nice because it does give you warnings on some stuff. So the other thing now, Chrome just announced they've given up on one of the certificate providers they're punting on.
Okay.
And basically said by October we're not going to support them anymore. So as I'm in DevTools, I can see sites and it'll say, hey, come version 70 of Chrome. We're not going to support them anymore, so you got to move to another certificate. So you at least get some of that kind of heads up stuff. You can get it in DevTools as well.
Yeah, I mean, I poke fun because it happens to everybody all the time, and it's 2018. Like it really feels like it shouldn't be that hard, but yet.
If I were in charge of it, like I said, it would be on my calendar for sure about 2 months before and pop up and do a warrant.
That's right. Yeah, and then you got to find a credit card to re-enable it. Yeah, it's just so much. You can't just buy them for like 20 years and be done with them.
That would be kind of handy, wouldn't it?
It would. If you could buy them on the same cycle as your domain. God, if there was just a place we could do that kind of stuff. I want to ask you a bit about your speaking career. I know that you're super active in the community. You mentioned the Pluralsight stuff earlier. Where do you draw inspiration to be as active as you are, and how do you keep that going on? I mean, you got a day job, right? So the coming to places like that conference and Code Mash and putting together the Pluralsight courses, where do you find inspiration for that and feel that energy?
So I guess where it started, we were an early adopter of .NET. So when .NET came out as a 1.0, we were using it while it was a beta and actually launching basically when it launched. So it was a good time about when I was starting to get interested in it. We were learning all sorts of things we had to do, a lot of workarounds, a lot of bugs and stuff. And I was attending conferences, and then I just felt like, I guess I was quite intimidated when I first started speaking.
Sure.
You walk into it. I went to major conferences all the time, and I thought these guys just, they know everything. I don't. I know a few things. So I actually went to some of them, and I thought there were some specific techniques that we were using that other people probably want to know. I mean, when you suffer through things, it's nice to share that with other people. So that's kind of how it started for me. I just said something I want to try, so I submitted. I actually ended up going to Australia as one of my various, so that's kind of a nice benefit for one of your first trips. And just I like to meet a lot of people. And it's surprising when people talk about speaking and such, they don't realize necessarily that I get as much out of it when I'm speaking as hopefully the people in the room, right?
Sure.
I mean, I make a lot of connections. I'll say something, somebody will come up and say, did you realize you could do this? And no, I didn't.
Yeah.
It's something that carries me forward. So that's really, I like to travel. Obviously, I love that conference. It's so family oriented. That's
Yep.
been a good opportunity for my wife and daughter too.
Yep.
So it's cool. It's a good way to get out and share. It's also inspiration. I do the trick where I say, I know a topic pretty well. I'm going to submit it as a proposal, and then I get it accepted. Now I have 3 months to know it a lot better.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
I mean, it's a motivator for me as well,
Sure.
just to
Sure.
get more involved with it and understand it better.
Sure. What would your advice be to somebody who maybe hasn't taken that step to speak or write, or I don't want to say teach, but maybe doesn't consider themselves a teacher, but yet wants to contribute? Like, what would your advice be there?
Well, the good news is now when I started, it was just major conferences. I mean, you really didn't have a lot of other opportunities. So I actually, when I had started it, I did articles first.
Yep.
So I did some articles just to get my name out. So I had something to refer to when I went to some other conferences. But now with user groups and so many meetups and other things, you really have a good opportunity to try it out and learn how it works and get some experience with it before you end up submitting for some of the larger conferences. So,
Sure.
and don't be afraid. I mean, everybody says imposter syndrome, and I still go through it all the time.
Yep.
Everybody, I think, does.
Yeah.
So you don't have to. I had to change my mentality that I don't have to know 100% about everything for HTTPS, for instance,
Sure.
because I
Sure.
won't, right? But I know enough that hopefully the 100 people in the room, that I give them something that they didn't know when they walked in.
Sure.
That's really what I'm shooting for.
Sure. How has things like producing a course for Pluralsight changed things? Because that seems to be similar but different, if you will.
Yeah, it was right when I started. I was actually watching, somebody had put out a tweet and they were on a treadmill and it had a course up on the treadmill. So I did zoom in, and it was my Fiddler course. I'm like, that's really weird. And then I happened to be speaking in Sweden like a month later, and the lady walked into the room and came up and started talking to me and said, "Oh, I watch while you do it." And I said, "Did you do the tweet with this?" And so it's just a small world. I've met a lot more people that way, just because my reach can be so much bigger and I can touch so many other people with those courses. So that's the good part of it. I can record it once. I can spend a lot of time on making sure that it's high quality, but I'm totally disconnected, right? I mean, that's the downside of it. I like being in the room where I can see facial reactions. I can see, are people getting it? They're not getting it. Let them ask specific questions that apply to them. So the mixture is something that I like, but it is definitely different in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I get a lot of energy from being in a room and talking to people and seeing the excitement and the sharing. And I've always looked at the speaking or the event as just a catalyst for a much larger conversation.
Yep.
It's an opportunity to connect with others. Everybody who walks into a room is walking in. I don't know that people necessarily realize this, but when everybody goes to a session or an event, they immediately already have something in common, right? It's either the speaker or the topic or the fact that you were just interested in the thing. And so I think we all too often kind of forget that everybody who's sitting around you or around a thing, you already have multiple things in common. And then now it's for you to kind of explore and expand your network and all that. And I often tell people that everybody has something to share. It's just a matter of finding the thing that you're most passionate about and you want to talk about, because and we live in a place where we can document the hell out of everything, right? Whether it's your own blog, Medium, and what we're doing right now, it's here to go to, for sure. What have been some of your favorite experiences, both either speaking and not speaking, and then what would be kind of your least favorite, and how have you grown as a speaker as a result of that, or as a developer professional?
Well, like I said, I think my favorite is just it's allowed me to travel a lot, which is a nice thing. So I like to travel, meet a lot of new people. I get to attend a lot of sessions. So people don't think about that either. As a speaker, I'm not there and giving my talks and leaving. I'm there going to all the rest of the sessions because I need to learn and keep up just like anybody else would. I've got a very specialized niche, but I'm just starting to look at some of the Azure Cognitive Services, looking at images and stuff. So it's something I'm not familiar with either, so it's cool to be able to step in and do all that stuff. So it gives me an opportunity to go to a lot of other sessions and meet a lot of other people. Yeah. I can't really think of any negatives. I guess the only negative things I've had attached to speaking is that when I talk to people, they don't think I'm a developer anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah, they say, well, you're a trainer. That's what and I'll just say, well, my full-time job, I'm a developer. I work on an e-commerce site, and I'm doing everything that you have to do during a normal day job. But that's been the only negative, is the perception that because I do that, it somehow diminishes me as a developer.
Interesting.
And I think the opposite. I mean, I've taken things that I know from work I've learned that I want to share, and I've taken tons of stuff from outside that I've learned from other sessions, or just digging into my own stuff and bring it back. So I've seen nothing but positive. That was the only thing that kind of caught me off guard. I didn't expect that, and trying to convince people that I can still develop even though I'm sharing.
That would catch me off guard too. I mean, I've always thought that anytime you have to teach something, regardless, I mean, something to your kids or, in a conference setting, whatever, that you really learn how to, I don't want to say refine your message, but understand how to convey that in such a way that you're going to teach at scale. And so while you may have understood a certain concept or thing, to actually be able to turn around and spit that out to somebody else through written word, audio, video, drawings, if you're David Neal, like it's hard. I mean, it takes time. Sure.
And you learn a lot, like you said. And I equate it, it's kind of funny, to the reverse. Have you ever heard, I think they call it rubber duck debugging? I don't remember what.
Yes.
Where
but
people,
explain it.
Yeah, so a senior developer was getting questions all the time. And he was kind of getting irritated with why I'm having all these same questions, which I would say document it.
Right, yeah.
And they don't have to answer all the time. But he basically said, I'm going to set up a rubber duck in my cube, and you come and tell your story to the duck. And once you explain the whole problem, if you still haven't figured out the answer by the time you've gone through that exercise, then I'll help you. And I don't remember what his percentage was, but it was like 90-some% of things get solved, like you said, just because you sit down and have to think about how do you organize your thoughts, what is it that I want to say, really helps advance. And most of them just figure it out on their own. So I think that's true with the speaking too.
Sure.
I mean, as I dig into it more, plus I just learn you're going to stand up in front of people. Yeah. I don't want to look bad. Back to the imposter syndrome. I know I don't have to do everything, but I also know that I want to put in very serious effort about it because people are taking time to come.
Sure.
Sure.
So my last question of the day is a big one, but before I get there, I want to extend some gratitude towards you and your family for everything that you've done, not just for the community, but, as part of that conference and whatnot. So much so that I want to point out a few things that you may or may not realize that I still have. One, which is the token from Australia when you went. You gave this, you as a family gave this to me a number of years ago. And even more so, what you may not realize is that Savannah gave me a rock a number of years ago that you guys we were passing out for the kids. And so I genuinely say thank you for everything that you've done for us, for your involvement with that. I think of the hard times that we've ever had, and I look back to things like the rock and get super inspired that, that kind of thing has happened. And so that leads me to my last question for you is, as the Boedigheimer geek family that you are, like how has that cultivated for you guys? How does it feel? How do you and Chris and Savannah, you go to conferences together, you get involved in these things. Like what advice, how can you kind of help others in that? Because I have 2 kids. My kids are tired of the conference by the time the conference comes. I know that we all kind of wish for our kids to do, be similar to us and do our things, but kind of sharing those experiences. And I see you guys as a family unit who certainly does that to a degree that's to be admired. So I know it's a big, hard question, which is why, I'm going to throw it out
Springing
there.
on me at the end.
Yeah, hey, surprise! Share your family secrets.
Yeah, I guess the good news for us, we like to spend a lot of time together.
Sure.
And really, for us as a family, I had been speaking for a long time. So Savannah just grew up with, I did article writing and they would travel with me a lot. So she kind of had an idea of what I did, but not really. And that conference was really the first time where they could get involved. I mean, at first it was just come in and see what it looks like,
sure.
Right? I mean, for my wife had been to a lot of conferences and stuff, but for Savannah to be able to come in and literally one time she came in and she was really excited and she was watching whatever the kids were doing in the program and she just came back after it was over and she goes, I'm going to do that next year. She was just so impressed. It was so cool. That opportunity is really what started it for us.
Sure.
Got her excited about it. Chris has been a programmer for a long time. And so just re-energizing her too for getting involved with sharing stuff that she's learning. And she's got a lot into how do you teach your kids to code, which helps because of that. So I just want to say thank you for all the opportunities we've had because that really launched both of them into being a lot more interested in speaking and a lot more into programming and all that stuff. So
it's cool to hear. I love working with your wife. I love seeing Savannah talk. I part of our mission is to get more kids to speak, and I think that we've succeeded when a set of adults actually go to Savannah's session and understand what she's doing and why she's doing it. I mean, my kids have your kids as well, have such a different perspective of computers in a life, and I couldn't imagine going to school in today's world as when we did. And we had a moment last night, actually. My daughter, they all have Google accounts at the schools, right? And so my son's had it since kindergarten, not quite since kindergarten, but since some age, 2nd or 3rd grade. And so my daughter's in 4th, my son's in 6th, and she had to write some paper type thing, right? So she wants us to read it, so she pulls up her Google account, and we go on a drive, and we start reading the thing. And so the moment here was that my son was like, she had asked Ethan if he ever had to do that in 4th grade. And he's like, I don't really remember. And he goes into his Google Drive account and he's like, oh yeah, I did. And now the two are comparing their homework assignments. Yeah. And it was like, wow, that's crazy different than, what you could have ever kind of imagined happening. And I don't know, it's cool.
Yeah, it's definitely a different world these days compared to when I started with it. I had gone through, end of high school before I was really exposed to programming.
Sure.
So it really wasn't until I was in college, and now everybody's got all the devices and everything else and the things they know and the things they try, and it's pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy. All right, sir. Well, with that, we will wrap it here. Thank you for the time today. Thank you for speaking. Everybody's going to go upgrade some SSL certificates and flip those check marks and all that good nonsense. And look forward to seeing you this summer.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right, everybody. Thank you. That is another edition of Ask That. Share us, like us, or just join us next time. See you.